Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is probably the fourth room in my house that I've been in, using it as an office. There have been a lot of changes in my home lately, but the most probably recent one is that I've just been too sick to do almost anything. So I just want to say thank you for your patience. You can still hear there's a little bit of gravel in my throat still. But I am hoping that I test negative this weekend so that I could come back in and see you all in the classroom if that's where you might be, and also to get my life back on track, hopefully catching up over the weekend. So here we are, and this week we're talking about from the medieval period, two particular theorists that I pick out to study from the medieval period because they are considered the two most influential so far, at least. As we learn and as we grow, as education progresses, one of the things that we do is we build on what we found that's new and build on what we know historically and put that into sort of a contemporary context so that we can use them. So when I look at your book and it has, 20 people listed under the medieval period, I'm pretty shocked because it grows bigger, it seems like, with every edition or every different book that I read. Part of that is because we're finding more stuff out there, but also because we are finding better or more ways to talk about the theorists that we've read and encountered. One of the reasons why rhetoric is something that you can sort of archaeologically dig up in the past scripts that other people have written is because it lives mostly until about the 1960s in English departments, literature. And so obviously, anytime there's writing, that literature is being studied. So what people write about literature, the way to interpret it, the way to write and deliver a message, it's because it's in written format already. There are things that we can apply to our oral tradition as well. So one of the things that we do is, it used to be thought that we took St. Augustine well out of context because he was writing for the other monks and for the other priests and for the other brothers and who were sharing the word of the Bible specifically. And we've taken that and sort of said, well, he was actually making comments about rhetoric a little bit more generally. And there's many reasons why people would say, well, no, it needs to stay within the realm of philosophy and religion. And there's very good reasons to say, no, it belongs in the study of rhetoric. I personally believe it belongs in the study of rhetoric as much as it might belong into those other two categories. I have read St. Augustine in my religion classes when I was in undergrad. I read them in my graduate classes when I was studying philosophy. And I've read them in my communication classes when I was studying rhetoric, and English classes, actually, in the English department at the University of Missouri. So this is a piece that you might run across several times. The second piece, or the second theorist that we talk about, Christine de Pizan, it's kind of funny. One time I was looking her up because I wanted to learn more about her before I went in to talk about her for one of the first times. And I ran across a piece from a Dr. Dudash at the University of Notre Dame who wrote a piece on Christine de Pizan because she studies French literature at the University of Notre Dame. No relation that I know of. I didn't reach out to her. I just thought that was sort of a funny thing that happened. Very rarely do I go and search in scholarly works and find my own name, but there are a few of them out there. So that's kind of neat and cool, and sort of something that just pops up whenever you're sort of going down what we might call rabbit holes as we are researching or studying. So the process of understanding rhetoric is not something that you learn and then you walk away and you've learned it. It doesn't really work that way. It's something that you sort of live with constantly. And for my part, I'm constantly researching it. Nobody else is doing that except people who teach rhetoric. But there may be a point in time when you come across something that you read later in life that is, I don't know, say the Da Vinci Code, for example. When that book came out, everybody was up in arms because what he was talking about was symbols. And in rhetoric, we study symbols just as much as they do in English and in iconography and in a few other areas, linguistics, particularly for that one. So you never know where you're going to run into it. That's why St. Augustine is important, and that's why Christine de Pizan is important. Even though it seems like they're talking about things that are completely irrelevant, they're not. And we're going to talk about how. I did not have you read too much of Augustine. I had you read the introduction, I believe, just so you could get a taste for what it was that he was doing. I'm going to talk specifically about On Christian Doctrine, but so you don't need to worry about that. But I did have you read some of Christine de Pizan, and hopefully you were able to follow that. It's not written in like sort of Old English or a really weird translation from Latin or anything, so it should have been relatively easy for you to follow. At least I'm hoping so. So before I get into it, the topic, let me just apologize if I cough or sniffle or get a drink of water or whatever during this. That is all part of my recovery process. So let's dig in, shall we? Now, we know that that during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages, people did not think highly of rhetoric. In fact, they thought it was evil. And we talked about why already in the last video, why they thought it was evil. And we know that probably the number one reason at the time that they thought about it was because it went against God, or it was one of the biggest sins that you could possibly partake in. So enter a sophist named Augustine of Hippo. Now, Augustine was a traveling teacher. He was a sophist. His mother's name was Monica, and I'll tell you why that's important later. And he would go from place to place in northern Africa, which you might know goes right up to the tip of southern Europe. And so he traveled to Rome and traveled all around as a sophist. He loved to eat. He loved to drink. He even had a child with a woman who he never married. The child died very young. The mother died very young. So that never went anywhere. But he did have a child for several years and had a wife, but they weren't married. So she was considered, I think, just sort of like a concubine or a partner of some sort, a travel companion, a companion of some sort. So he lived this life full of food, wine, song, love, etc., violating all of the tenets of what would be considered a Christian life at that time. And he was practicing sophistry, and he loved it. He acknowledges that he loves it. He has a work called The Confessions, where he talks about how much he loves doing all the things that he's doing, even though he knows that they're wrong. Thus, it's called Confessions. And he goes through this like for many, many years of his life, through most of his young life, whatever that is back then. At some point, he has an epiphany in his world where he decides to turn to Christianity. He wants to renounce all of the sins that he has partaken in. He wants to leave. He does not want to leave sophistry. That's his livelihood, that's his job, that's his life. So he doesn't want to leave it, but in order to become a Christian, he had to renounce it. So what ends up happening, and the reason why I told you Monica was important, is there is a story, and I don't know how true this is. This is told in the Catholic religion. I don't think it's told anywhere else, but Monica apparently prayed every single day for Augustine to become a Christian, to get rid of his pagan ways, which came from his father, by the way. His father was a pagan and she was a Christian. And she would pray, excuse me, for him to become a Christian. Well, she succeeded. And we don't know if he became a Christian after she died or what happened, but in the Catholic religion, that's considered a miracle on earth, and so in her name, and so therefore she was granted sainthood. So she's known as Saint Monica, and thus Augustine later, I don't know how he became Saint Augustine, but he did. He's one of the saints that they worship or that they pray to in the Catholic Church. That's why a lot of people, when they refer to Augustine, they don't say Augustine of Hippo, they say Saint Augustine. Okay, and that's probably how I'll refer to him as well, just because that's his title that I've always learned. So it's habit more than anything else. So he decides to become a Christian, and he starts practicing Christianity, and in doing so, does not want to give up the sophistry, enters into a monkhood, and in that brotherhood, he realizes that he could use his skill to teach others how to preach. And in doing so, he outlines all of the ways that we can use rhetoric to serve God and to serve Christianity. And that's sort of where On Christian Doctrine comes from. And, you know, the first piece is about being a teacher. The second piece is about being a teacher of Christian doctrine. So how does this work? Well, most of his work is focused on invention, okay? Because the biggest complaint, again, is that your speech practices or your topic area, your subject matter doesn't come from God. That's the big complaint. So if we are going to talk about where speech comes from and justify using it in the church, so to speak, how are we going to go about doing that? We have to address this big elephant in the room of invention, where our knowledge comes from, where our talent comes from. And so obviously there's a couple things that we need to remember. The first thing that we need to remember is that the Bible is the source of the truth. So there shouldn't be anything beyond the Bible. Secondly, if you're going to interpret the Bible, which obviously Augustine does, if you're going to practice hermeneutics and interpret the Bible, you better know where all of that comes from. You better have all the knowledge, just like Cicero said. See, part of the problem with Augustine was that he really liked Cicero, and he wouldn't give him up, even though Cicero was a pagan and everything else, right? He wouldn't give him up. So he said instead, yes, you should know everything about your topic. So where do you find that? It can't be just from the Bible because that's pretty static. It stays the same. So Augustine says that before anyone speaks, before you practice the art of rhetoric, you must first pray. And if you pray, then you will get the knowledge that you need in order to preach appropriately. Okay? So as far as invention is concerned, for St. Augustine, you must look at the Bible and second, pray on it. And then you take that God-inspired word and share it with others. Now, Augustine's pretty clear that also in invention there are three purposes for practicing rhetoric in the church. Okay? To preach, to teach, and to convert. Okay? To preach, to teach, and to convert. Now, interestingly enough, remember back to the last lecture when I told you that one of the reasons why people considered rhetoric evil was because Satan was the first to use it in the Bible, the snake who convinced Eve to take of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, right, and all that. Well, Augustine says if it's true that that Satan was the first one to use rhetoric and that he uses it to tempt us and to persuade us, then Christians should use it to fight against the devil, to fight against evil. So people who are Christian need to understand rhetoric in order to be able to battle the evil that is brought in by Satan and his minions, and to battle the evil in the world. So what does that have to do with those three purposes for rhetoric? It's very simple. When you preach, what are you doing? You're teaching people about the Bible. You're teaching people about, in this case, Christianity. You're teaching people, in this case, about what God wants for you. All right, those are the things that you're preaching about. What are you doing when you're teaching? Well, generally speaking, you're talking to people who may have very little knowledge about Christianity, about God, about the Bible. And so the first thing you have to do is teach them before you can preach and let them enjoy what you're saying. We'll get to that in a minute. Finally, convert. You need to persuade people to become Christian, to accept it as a way of life. So you're not just teaching them, you're not preaching to the choir, you're actually converting them to Christianity. These three purposes also go along with three different levels of style, according to Augustine. It is up to a lot of different interpretation as to which style goes with which. And so I think that this is mostly a question, but here's what I'm going to say, and I think this is a good way to think about it, okay? This was the way I first learned about Augustine and the three levels of style, and I think it's a pretty reliable one. In order to teach, you must be able to convince people to listen to you, but at the same time, you have to talk to them at their level. Teaching is sort of a common level, the common style. You're trying to use words that they can grasp onto, metaphors that they understand, make references that they're going to acknowledge and be able to understand clearly in order to even listen to you, in order to be taught. Okay? Conversion requires persuasion, which means that it requires you to bring people in and want them to adopt the faith. Now, most people might argue that that's the grand style, but I am going to argue that it's the middle style, and here's why. When you're converting people, when you're persuading them, you first must teach them something. They have to learn about something and then be persuaded for why they should act. So you're teaching them some new things, but you're also trying to inspire them to convert. So the middle style. Finally, and this is going to sound completely weird, but preaching. Preaching is when you are basically aiming to please. You're aiming to please your audience. Preaching is, you know what you're talking about, your audience knows you know who you're talking about, and they want to hear something that is lively and inspired, doesn't take a whole lot of thought on their part because they're already converted, right? So that whole line, preaching to the choir, in other words, you're telling me things I already agree with you on, right? That's where this comes from. That idea of preaching to people who are already believers and who want to hear you talk about Christianity or the Bible or whatever your subject matter is that day. So for St. Augustine, there are three purposes to using rhetoric in the church: to teach, to preach, and to convert. And there are three levels of style which can be related to each of those to achieve different goals that come out from practicing rhetoric in the church. In order to practice rhetoric appropriately, you absolutely must pray first and know what you can about the Bible. All right? So you have to be educated in the Bible, and you have to be able to pray in silence to get the Word of God, which is the truth. Again, I'm not telling you this is how it is. I'm telling you what St. Augustine says in his works, okay? And then, of course, the reason why we should use it in the church is to fight against Satan. So one of the very important reasons that we shouldn't practice rhetoric is the very reason that we should, in order to counter Satan. Okay, I am getting really scratchy, and so I realize that this is just a short 15-minute video to cover Augustine. I am going to come back with a second video and move on to Christine de Pizan. So hopefully that'll be okay with you. I'll see you in just a blink of an eye.